Welcome to Roundtable Radio. Through our conversations, we discover the holy and the ordinary, look for moments of grace and peace, and redefine what we talk about when we talk about faith. Hello, Ed.
Hey, Leslie, how are you?
I'm good. How you doing?
Doing well. Thank you.
So we are into Lent now.
Mm-hmm.
And we have done a few episodes over the years on sort of like what is Lent and this idea of traditions people do and some options you have. And I know many friends are doing many things. I have a lot of colleagues and friends who are taking complete breaks off of social media, which I respect completely.
We applaud that.
We do applaud that. I'm adjusting something. Sorry. So within that idea, I think also it's easy. I kind of see the Lent choices or the Lent disciplines as kind of like New Year's resolution 2.0. There's an element of like doing something. They're back. Yeah. They're back better than ever and now with religious motivation.
Right.
And I think it's interesting that they kind of come one after the other. And I appreciate it because it sometimes gives me a second chance to like recommit myself to the thing I'm trying to do for myself or for my own spiritual development or whatnot.
Sure.
So help us, Ed. Let's say, for example, maybe we had some intentions we set for Lent and maybe 7 days later, it maybe hasn't stuck yet. Or maybe we're like getting a rolling start. Obviously, this is completely hypothetical and not at all set in reality.
However, I think in using the old phrase, I resemble that remark. So
we all do for sure. Help us, please.
Help. Yeah.
Help.
Great comment. I love resolutions 2.0. I've never thought of Lent like that. So that's going to give me a new angle from which to look at this ancient discipline. You know, I was just in the middle of the day today realizing I'd gone way sideways from some of my basic intentions and, like started off pretty well. And then, wow. The last couple of days sort of veered hard right or hard left, whichever, but off the main path. Yeah. And the word that just popped into my head was reset. But, interestingly enough, one of my, I picked a few things that I wanted to try to, and this year I sort of called them ways, as opposed to maybe disciplines or habits, like exploring these different ways of connecting with the holy or connecting with the earth. And actually one of them was, not surprisingly probably, but I had a book that I hadn't looked at in a while. And it's a collection of Lenten meditations by an Old Testament scholar, Walter Brueggemann. We've mentioned him a few times on our podcast. And he's a really, really phenomenal writer and thinker. But somebody collected 40 of his very short pieces for Lent. And in one of them, he actually talks about reset. He says that one of the themes that runs through the Bible, especially I would say in the Old Testament, is this sense that God reaches out to people, with this desire to form a covenant, an agreement, a relationship. And the people say yes, and then they fall away, and then they have to have a reset, and they do the whole thing over again. The people fall away again, and so it goes. It's this very, very repetitive theme, runs all the way through the books of the Old Testament. So I thought of that because there is a passage where God says, the advice of the writer, who is one of the prophets, says, seek God while God may be found, and return to God with all your heart, and God will forgive you abundantly. So obviously, in this case, the people have done something wrong. They've really deviated from their path of justice and peace and righteousness, need to come back home. And that's a reset. And the prophet is there to help them understand, A, it's possible. You can do it. Yes, you veered off, but you can return and you can start this again. And I have come to believe that Lent is like my own personal reliving of that story. Just I start off, veer, come back, veer, and back and forth it goes. But through it all, maybe the thread that's to be really uncovered there is grace. That we're thinking the right way. We've got our intentions are set in good directions, but we kind of get off the path. And yet, for this prophet, there's always the return. So I really love that. I love that theme.
There's so much that's interesting there. The first thing I think about this idea of grace, the connection I'm making in my mind, is I follow this fantastic, and also very humorous, fitness person on Instagram. His name is Jordan Syatt, and he's very realistic about health goals, about fitness goals, and he says, whenever it's about longevity, it's about consistency over time, and it's not about hitting 100%, because nobody's going to hit 100%.
Right.
And he said, if you were doing 80%, then you are absolutely crushing it, and you are doing it perfectly. Which, for a person like me who wants to, if I'm going to dive into something, I'm going to do it to such a neurotic level that I have to every day take a mark. And then the first day that I mess up, I'm like, well, it's all over. It's all over now. And I've messed up completely. And the comparison he uses is, say you're driving down the road and you get a flat tire. What do? You fix the flat tire and you keep going with your day. Giving up at that point is like getting a flat tire, then going around and slashing your other 3 tires.
Right. Or just walking away and leaving the car for someone else to collect. Right?
Perfect. Equally, yes. And but this idea of if it's not perfect, if you haven't done something by what your standards are, which might be potentially unrealistic, then don't give the whole thing up. Don't slash your other 3 tires. Don't just walk away from your car in the middle of the road. And I found that to be a helpful illustration, even if I don't follow it very well myself. It's a learning process. But I found that to be helpful, this idea of okay, you messed up. Don't destroy the rest of your day.
Right. Yeah. Let's wreck everything now.
You're right. Yeah. I think that's such an interesting and helpful illustration of what kind of grace with yourself can look like. And I feel like if we can have some grace with ourselves, then we can then maybe be better about extending it to others and accepting it in our faith.
I love that. I love it. And when you introduce us at the very beginning so beautifully, as we search for the holy in the ordinary, maybe that is the most powerful expression of the holy in the ordinary, this stream of grace that runs all throughout our lives. And so when we've haven't hit 100% and we're hard on ourselves, or we feel like we're just going to trash the whole enterprise that we've started, this is the time to kind of turn back to that grace that says, come back home, come back to the center, and start off again. And I guess I have two quick thoughts about that. One of them is that the question we might ask is, okay, so why? Why did we lose our focus? And the answer might be because my tire, met a nail or a sharp object, and I had absolutely no control over it. So, period. There's a lot of life is like that it was beyond our control, and that wasn't anything we could have seen coming, and it happens, and then you adjust from there. Maybe some other times we make really conscious decisions to say, in Lent, I really wanted to do this, but nah, I'm doing that because I just feel like it. And that also provides its own learning opportunity. And I think maybe the missing ingredient here is that we don't stop to say, okay, why did I lose my focus, and how can I learn from that? I might be able to build on that going into the future. And I guess the other comment that I'm thinking of, there was something that you said that triggered this. There's a Norwegian poet, Olaf Hauge, and he says in one of his poems, and I'm paraphrasing this, but he said, he got so frustrated that when he was taking a bow and arrow, using his bow and arrow, that, he couldn't hit the center until he said, I realized that wherever my arrow landed, it was the center of something.
Oh, fantastic.
Isn't that a wonderful sort of idea? So, yeah, maybe you missed, but what did you hit? Something completely unexpected. And, I just think of people, who, from musicians to sculptors or whatever, who must get so frustrated creating something and then just want to smash the instrument, and then realize, wait a second. What was that sound again? I didn't really want to create that, but that's kind of interesting. Let's go back to that. So, a couple of thoughts.
Have you had a chance to see on Netflix American Symphony?
No, I have not.
It's the documentary of John Batiste, the jazz musician. You should see it. Everyone should see it.
A friend told me about this just recently and said how remarkable it was.
I meant to bring it up at our staff lunch today as a piece of film that it's fantastic. It's a beautiful piece of film. But it's about his wife who has, I believe, leukemia.
Yes.
He was very sick and continues to be sick. So it's beautiful and it's so interesting, and sort of the through thread. One of the through threads of the film is his creating this symphony and his sort of unorthodox way of writing it, which left a lot of space for improvisation from the musicians, which was very interesting and led to a lot of interesting conversations at our household about how, like, classical musicians, we're used to the notes on the page.
Right. Yeah.
And if you give us like
blank space,
we're going to have a panic attack. Like, that is not a comfort zone situation.
Right.
But this idea of like, what can you create if you're in this situation, I think is also very interesting. It's a tenuous connection to what you were saying, but it just brought to mind this you have something going on, and like, what can you create out of that? It's a documentary, so it's not really spoiling anything, but the debut of his symphony, they like had a power failure.
Oh my good heavens.
And he just starts playing.
Oh, wow.
Like this person is stunningly talented. It's funny because we were talking at home about how, like, the jazz musicians claim him as theirs, and then the classical musicians, when he won the Grammys, we claimed him as ours. We're like, no, he's a classical musician. He went to Juilliard. He's a classical musician. Like originally nobody wanted him, but now everybody wants him. Like, it's sort of funny as like in our clubs, it's interesting to watch. Going back to what you were saying though, I'm interested in this idea of like this image of the reset button.
Yeah.
Because this idea of starting over, I think, to me, can sometimes feel like, for instance, playing Super Mario, and you have to hit, like, you lose a life, you die, you have to restart, and you have to go all the way back to the beginning of the level.
Yep.
And I sometimes feel like that when I, when I get a flat tire and I have to give, like, when I make a mistake or with something I'm trying to do or something, sometimes it feels like, we have to really start back at the beginning. Like, how can we? I mean, I appreciate that every time we do something, we have more knowledge and more experience. But like, what would you say if someone's feeling like that about having to start over multiple times, maybe with something they're trying to do or learn or be better at?
Well, one of the quick responses I have to that is that I'm not sure, and I'm not sure I would say this to a person, depending on what their issue was, right? Because maybe they're trying to escape a cycle of addiction. Who knows what it is, where they are constantly feeling like, oh, I'm right back where I started, or even worse, who knows? But one of the things I would say, Leslie, about that, and I think it's a very important question in terms of our own inner growth, the growth of our soul, the innermost part of our being, is that I'm not sure we're very good at gauging our progress. We feel like we're involved in regress, but I think you said it also yourself that we know that we're gaining knowledge. We know that we're gaining maybe a little bit of impetus, but we still feel like it's gone back to zero. Many times I think people feel like that, and then we'll be told around many different kinds of issues, but then we'll be told by a loved one or a teacher, oh no, this is where you were, and look at where you are now. But we can't see that very well for some reason. And I do think that's why, spirituality often flourishes in community because others can say that and see that for us. So I think you've raised a really, really good question. And so part of it is that, I think we have to really figure out at the outset, how gracious are we going to be to ourselves? Because what we perceive as no growth may in fact be some growth. And it builds cumulatively, very slowly over time. And so I think that is something that maybe we're not told enough early on, or, that it's going to feel flat for a while before you start feeling like, oh gosh, I okay, now I can see the progress too. And there's a novel that I read long time ago. It's probably one of the maybe 2 or 3 books that I could read and reread over and over and over again. It's called A Dry White Season by Andre Brink. And it's about a white school teacher in South Africa. These were during the days of apartheid, who becomes involved in the drama of a black family that's been just harmed horrendously by apartheid, by the policies and people related to apartheid. And so he gets involved in this situation to become an advocate for someone. And he's explaining to a black taxi cab driver who lives in Soweto, he said, it's nothing. I've done nothing. We're going nowhere. We're not making any progress. And the taxi cab driver says to him, you may feel for a very, very long time that you are going in no positive direction. But he said, when you turn and look behind you one day, there will be no doubt about the distance that you have traveled. And I think it's that moment where we turn around and say, oh, I see. I have traveled a little bit of distance here. But that takes sometimes that takes someone to help us look in that way, which is what one man was able to do for this other man. But it's a very good question. I'm not sure that I've answered it, but that would be a couple of pieces that I would put forth.
I think that's great. It makes me think one of my favorite yoga teachers is on YouTube. Yoga with Adrienne is her channel. I think your spouse also enjoys her.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
And she has done she does these January everyday yoga classes where she'll put out a video every day in January and does these series. They're fabulous. And she's many times very intentional in the first class of the year, talking about the word acceptance, which I think she means very much as a synonym of grace. And she uses it as taking a neutral but honest look at yourself and kind of taking stock, but saying, okay, here is where I am and I accept that. It's not I love it necessarily, because obviously I think for many of us, we want to be better in a lot of different ways. But it's not like a force, like, oh, I love myself. It's this idea of like, I accept where I am, and I'm excited for the future and to move forward. But that you can't, that in her teaching, she talks about how like that, to her, that idea, this acceptance, this grace is going to be a really critical step in allowing yourself to move forward and maybe freeing yourself from some self limiting thoughts, some, some inner voices that are maybe not serving you or being loving towards yourself. And I think your idea of grace and her concept of acceptance, I think, are very much in parallel.
There's two words there I would just love to, phrases that you use that I just want to lift up again, because I've come across them in my work, studying to be a coach and doing some coaching with others. And one of them is the freeing part. I think that's what being in community, at least a community of faith, I think is really designed to do, is to free us from the habits or the practices, the attitudes that bind us to an understanding of ourselves that's not whole or holy. And the other phrase that you used is self-limiting. And one of the things that coaches do is to point out, hopefully through questions, when a person is being coached, they will sometimes say, "Oh, I'll never be able to, learn that thing," or "I have a dream, but there's no way that I'm going to ever get there." And it's that self-limiting language that becomes so powerful for us, and eventually it shapes our reality. And I think that one of the things that Adrienne is doing through her yoga practice is saying, no matter where you are, the first step really is to accept where you are, and then that becomes your basis, and it doesn't become the end point, but it's where you start from. And if I can draw an image from tennis here for a moment, I was talking with one of the persons who teaches tennis in Greenwich once, and we were talking about the tennis player Novak Djokovic, who's kind of an interesting player because he's not nearly the fan favorite that Roger Federer has always been, for example, or Rafael Nadal, or so many of the great women players. But he's very, very successful. And I asked this pro, I said, "What do you think is the one thing that makes him so successful?" And he actually said, "Because he knows how to reset better than anyone else. So that when he is pushed way out of position and it looks like the point is over, he is so patient. And the next shot he hits, he doesn't try to do anything overly ambitious. He just tries to get himself back onto the court so that he can restart the point." And I think that if you can accept ourselves, in that situation where we've been pushed off center, then we can say, okay, my next move is just to get back to center. It's not, to try to push myself way forward here. Let's just get back to home base here. And then we'll start it up again. And I thought that was an amazing thing to say, that he resets better than anyone else, because in that way, it's like he's never out of the point. And that must be so frustrating to play a person who is that patient. You just know he's never going to damage his own chances of winning. And I think there's a little bit of an analogy in there in terms of how we can see ourselves when we feel like we're kind of out of center and how we need to find our way back home.
Yeah, that's exactly the word I was thinking of when you were beginning to tell that story, this idea of centering. That resetting is centering, is grounding, is finding the home of within yourself. I think that's just so interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
There was something I was going to say about that. Oh yeah. Excuse me. Excuse me. So I was there was a article that came out, I don't know, about a year ago, that was like, how these articles go around about parenting, it's like the top 5 things that Harvard parents and Fortune 500 CEO, like basically like how to help your kid be
perfecto.
Yeah, exactly. But one did stick with me of a valued trait or a valued skill that adults kind of, I wish they had more of, or whatever. The idea that of resiliency. And your tennis player story made me think of this sort of idea of a resilient person. And I had never until just now thought that maybe resiliency is this idea of being able to come back to center over and over and over again without judgment or with grace for yourself.
Right.
Just be like, and here we go again, and it's this
Right.
idea. And, I think we've talked before about, this idea of like a fear of failure. This reset button has so many connections points. It's so interesting. But like this idea, if you're, failing is part of learning and part of growing, but like you have to, after every failure, you kind of reset and retry. And I think if you go into something expecting it to happen, it's, I was thinking, here's a tenuous connection for you.
Make it.
I was telling you before that we just got a 3D printer.
Yes.
And they can be a little finicky. This one is particularly fancy and has many like gadgets and gizmos aplenty that help it to be a little bit easier to operate. But a lot of them will go nuts. Like there's a feature that it's called spaghetti, which is basically like when it just starts like shooting filament everywhere. It's a new word for it.
Oh, that's an image we could probably all identify with.
Right? Just like we're going spaghetti, folks. But this idea that I think for that, knowing that it's finicky, I go into every project being like, well, this is draft 1 of maybe 10. We're doing mock-ups here. We're not going for a final product.
Right.
We're drafting it out. We're trying things out. We're experimenting, and that kind of mindset. And then if you get something good, you're like, oh, well,
Yeah.
hot diggity.
Yeah.
Which is an interesting, I think, mindset when you're working on something. It's, I find that helpful. To just be like, that my expectations for this thing at least are more normal than the expectations I usually have for myself. I'm like, no, this has to be perfect the first time, even though I don't know what I'm doing.
If you can treat yourself as graciously as you treat your 3D printer, you're going to be fine. Just fine, Leslie.
I have to make that a quote on Instagram. That's going to be amazing. Oh, glorious. People are going to be like, what is happening to these guys? They've lost their minds.
I know.
I love it. But I think it's really interesting, this idea of like just the grace we give ourselves or don't give ourselves, frankly. And that it's this reset. There's a lot in that, sort of that hitting that reset button. There's a lot in there, isn't there?
There's a memory that just bubbled up to the surface. I was presiding at a wedding. This was many years ago, and this was a second marriage for both members of the couple. And the bride's daughter, who was a teenager, desperately wanted to sing. She had a beautiful voice. She wanted to sing a song on the guitar to her mother and to her stepfather. And but she was incredibly nervous. And so she started singing, and it was, it was clear that she wasn't either going to be able to finish because she was very emotional, and it just was not working. And her mother said, "Sweetie, it's fine. If you want to start again, that's fine." And so everybody took a breath. It was so beautiful. I think everybody's shoulders just dropped a couple of inches. And her daughter proceeded to sing this most beautiful song.
Aww.
And it was a reset moment where she did not worry about what had taken place, and nobody could have cared less. And then she sang this song, which was absolutely perfect. And I thought, what a moment of grace for her mother to have said that, and just completely in a composed way, relaxed way. Don't worry about it. Take your time. We're here. And it gave her, going back to your earlier word, gave her the freedom to start it up again. And it's like, grace is almost this thing that says, you know what, no matter where you've gone to, you can always come back here and call this place here and start from here again and move forward. And I think to me, that's really the heart of religion. It's that gracious heart reaching out to us, calling us forward, but accepting the fact that, it's could be going to be wobbly sometimes. you know? So,
That's wonderful. I love that. Thank you, Ed. Thank you so much for all of those thoughts. I'm going to be thinking about hitting reset, having grace for myself, and hopefully extending that even more to others. And we are so thankful to all of you for joining us today. Round Hill Radio is brought to you by the friends and members of Round Hill Community Church. For more information, please visit roundhillradio.org.
If you enjoyed this podcast, there are a few things that you can do that would make a big difference to us. Like the video, subscribe if you aren't, and click the notification bell and select all. Thank you.